Hey everybody, your old pal Jeff Urbin here at the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, speaking to you live from downtown beautiful Hyde Park. So today we are going to talk a little bit about the upcoming holiday, which is, no, not Thanksgiving, that's the other November holiday, but today we're going to talk a little bit about Veterans Day. So coming up we have Veterans Day, which is a very important day. It's kind of like Thanksgiving in the sense that we give thanks to our veterans, in this case, not to our general blessings and things like we have when we eat over turkey. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Veterans Day and what it meant to FDR and what it means to our nation, and most importantly, what it means to our veterans. Now, sometimes people will confuse the meanings of Veterans Day in November with Memorial Day in May. And that's understandable, as there are some similarities. But basically, Veterans Day, which we celebrate in November, celebrates the sacrifice, the courage, the duty, the teamwork of all the men and women who have served this country in our armed forces. And Memorial Day in May is a day that commemorates all of those men and women who died in the service of our country, who made the ultimate sacrifice of laying down their lives so that we can live free and safe. So that's the difference, right? Both of them honor folks in the military, but Memorial Day is for those who have given the ultimate sacrifice, and Veterans Day are for those that are still around, walking around among us. And Veterans Day is a very important American holiday, but it's also an important holiday in other countries around the world. Sometimes in other countries it is known as Armistice Day, and sometimes in other countries it is known as Remembrance Day. And it was originally Armistice Day in this country, and we'll get to that in just a second. Now, whatever term you use to mark this day, it can trace its origins back to the end of the First World War. After a horrendous amount of years of fighting, 4 or 5 years of fighting, and a ghastly loss of life, an armistice or truce was finally declared on the 11th hour of the 11th day in the 11th month in 1918, bringing to end a horrific conflict that was euphemistically called things like the Great War or the war to end all wars. And of course, we know that that wasn't the case. And on that cold November morning, 11 o'clock on November 11th, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. And an estimated 16 million people had been killed in that conflict. So it was a huge, huge conflict. A year later, in November 1919, Woodrow Wilson, remember him? Good old Woodrow. Woodrow Wilson proclaimed November 11th as the first celebration of Armistice Day. And Armistice Day is basically just a fancy word for truce, okay? And they went with Armistice Day, I think, over Truce Day because they didn't want to confuse the third day of the week, which is Tuesday, with Truce Day. And I don't know if that's actually true, but neither do you, so let's just go with that. And that reminds me of a little story. There were these 3 old artillery buddies, and they went out one morning for a walk. And the first one says, "Boy, it's windy." And the second one says, "No, it's thirsty." And the third one says, "Yeah, me too. Let's go get a drink." Right? Because they were old artillery buddies. I just want to point out that hearing loss is no joke. And if you or someone you know is suffering from hearing loss, you should seek medical advice and professional help immediately. Now, FDR, who served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, was a big fan of Woodrow Wilson. In fact, Woodrow Wilson was one of his idols. FDR had put Woodrow Wilson's name in nomination for the presidency, and when Woodrow Wilson won, he appointed Franklin Roosevelt to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So after Woodrow Wilson declares Armistice Day as November 11th, 1919, it goes along, as an official day, but it wasn't totally official as an American holiday until May of 1938. And from then on, it became an official government holiday. So originally, Armistice Day was set aside to honor veterans who had served in the First World War. But by 1954, having been through an even more horrendous war, right, the Second World War, and 3 costly years of the Korean War, Armistice Day was changed to become Veterans Day. So some of you older folks in the audience may remember back when it was Armistice Day, but that was switched over in 1954. And the idea of calling it Veterans Day was so that the nearly 18 million men and women who had served in World War II and Korea, and who were still among us, would also have a day that honors them, not just those who fell during the First World War. Now, Veterans Day is not a holiday like a traditional holiday, right? It's not simply a day off of work. Okay, so that's your modus operandi for celebrating Veterans Day. Okay, you got a little bit of a misplaced priority there. It's not just a day off of work. It is not just a day for holiday sales. Okay, it's not a holiday in the traditional sense that there, other than the flag and parades, there's not really, Veterans Day decorations, that you would buy in the dollar store and put up. And there's no real special food associated with Veterans Day. But what it is a day of remembrance, a day of reflection, a day of gratitude for those who have served us. And every Veterans Day, there is a solemn ceremony held at the Tomb of the Unknowns in Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., and a wreath is placed on the grave of the Tomb of the Unknowns. And this is a picture of none other than our hero, Franklin Roosevelt, right over here, who is laying a wreath on that tomb. And again, the importance here is that these are folks who who have served us and in some cases given their lives. Now, us regular folks, we may not have a Tomb of the Unknown that we can go and visit, but maybe we'll visit one of our relatives or one of our friends who was a veteran and had passed away. Or even better, maybe we have a veteran over. Maybe we go and thank a veteran. Maybe we buy them a root beer or a cup of coffee and simply say, thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for the sacrifice that you made on our behalf. So, May 1938, FDR makes Armistice Day, now known as Veterans Day, an official national holiday. Now, why would he want to do that? Well, yes, he was in World War I, right? So it's a way to sort of honor, the folks he served with. Yes, he was a fan of Woodrow Wilson. Okay, and hey, it's a nice way to honor him. But mostly, he understood the importance of service. In fact, he had wanted to go to Annapolis and have a career in the Navy, but his mother wouldn't let him because it would, mean he was off at sea for too many times a year, too much time over the course of the year, and she wouldn't see him. And so he put that aside and went into politics. And he, of course, becomes commander-in-chief as president. And he said on October 27th, 1944, I bear a responsibility that I can never shirk and never for one instance forget. For the Constitution of the United States says, the president shall be the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States. And Franklin Roosevelt took this very, very seriously. In fact, he finds himself as commander-in-chief during a time when America is facing down its greatest foreign threat since the Revolution itself. And he believed that the generation that he was leading had been marked by history. In 1936, he said, "To some generations, much is given. Of other generations, much is expected. This generation has a rendezvous with destiny." Now, he's saying this even in 1936. So we're still in the Great Depression. So tension building up over there in Europe. But he knows that this is the generation that has been called to service, that has been called to great sacrifice. And this was true first in the Great Depression on the home front, and then again in World War II. And Franklin Roosevelt understood the suffering of American people. He was really a president that was in touch with what was going on in the country. And this was both in peace and in war. During the Great Depression, he understood families were having trouble putting food on the table. He understood that families were sometimes being broken apart as an older son is sent off to go find work, or maybe becomes a hobo riding the rails looking for work, or grandma and grandpa, are no longer able to live on their own, so they move in, with the family, and putting a certain stress on the family that way. Or maybe dad goes off looking for work and mom is left there to keep the rest of the family together. He understood what was going on in America during the Great Depression, and he understood what was going on in America during the war. In a December 9th, 1941 fireside chat, just 2 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he told the American people, and I quote, "We are now in this war. We are in it all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history. We must share together the bad news and the good news, the defeats and the victories, the changing fortunes of war." And what he was saying in that speech was that he understood that, we were going to have some good times, we were going to have some bad times. It was going to ebb and flow, and it was going to go back and forth before things finally started to really move in a trajectory that would lead to victory for the United States and for the Allies. And he wanted to make sure that people understood that. So within 48 hours of the attack at Pearl Harbor, he's laying out there's going to be good times, there's going to be bad times. There's going to be good news, there's going to be bad news. These are the changing fortunes of war. He knew what we were in for because he had seen this before. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, Franklin Roosevelt took it upon himself to make sure that he just didn't sit in Washington, behind a desk and run the Navy. He got out, he saw things, he understood what was going on out on the battlefield. And in some ways, being the Assistant Secretary of the Navy was the perfect dress rehearsal for becoming Commander-in-Chief during the Second World War. It gave President Roosevelt insight into what to do and how to do it. Right, having been Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he knew how to get ships filled with men and supplies across the ocean to Europe to fight in the First World War. And it also gave him the insights into the horrors that war could bring. In fact, he described this himself, how he understood it in such great detail, in a speech that he gave at Chautauqua, New York, on August 14th, 1936. I have a copy of that speech here, and I'd like to read you a paragraph where President Roosevelt describes his experience with war. He says, "I have seen war. I have seen war on land and sea. I have seen blood running from the wounded. I have seen men coughing out their gassed lungs. I have seen the dead in the mud. I have seen cities destroyed. I have seen 200 limping, exhausted men come out of line, the survivors of a regiment of 1,000 who went forward 48 hours before. I have seen children starving. I have seen the agony of mothers and wives. I hate war." And in fact, he did hate war. So FDR knew the sacrifice of the soldiers and the sacrifice of their loved ones from his own personal experience. And he thought about that all the time. This was something that, although he was able to compartmentalize and, just lose himself in a movie for an hour or two, or lose himself, in his stamp book collection, for an hour or two, he needed those breaks because most of the time he was thinking about what Americans were going through. And he cared about them every single day, and he was with them in spirit every step of the way. And he wanted to make sure that they had everything they needed to get the job done swiftly, safely, and surely. Now, during the Great Depression, many countries in the world, right, because it was a worldwide, global economic depression, many countries in the world decided that they were going to solve their economic problems. They were going to solve their unemployment problems. They were going to solve their production problems by turning their economies to building weapons of war, to producing tents and tanks and bullets and bombers. And Roosevelt's focus was not that. His focus was on creating jobs, and creating jobs through the creation of peaceful public infrastructure like bridges and roads and schools and hospitals and libraries and electric lines, many, many, many of which we are still using to this day. In fact, 50% of the infrastructure in the United States built during the Great Depression with the New Deal programs. So the infrastructure that Roosevelt built during the New Deal programs, right, during the Great Depression, this was critical to the United States winning the war, because we were able to become the arsenal of democracy and began turning out every conceivable item that would be needed to defeat the Nazis. Now, I don't think Roosevelt was thinking, wow, let's do an infrastructure so that someday if we ever get in a war, we've got all the development here. But that's exactly what happened. By the time we got into the war, we had all this infrastructure ready to go. We just needed to gear it up for defense purposes. And Roosevelt felt that our military personnel, if they were going to be in harm's way, then they were going to be there with the best and most abundant equipment possible. And from 1939 to 1945, right, just 6 short years, we went from having 334,473 unprepared military personnel on active duty. When I say unprepared, I mean they didn't have the equipment they needed. They didn't have the training they needed. It was by no fault of their own. We had let our army atrophy after the First World War. So that was 1939. 6 years later, by 1945, we had 12,123,455 totally trained and equipped men and women in uniformed service. So Roosevelt understood that if we were going to be in this thing, we were going to be in this thing big, and we were going to make sure that we win, and we were going to make sure that our folks had what they needed. And in fact, our wartime production was staggering. Get a load of these numbers, folks. 299,293 aircraft, 634,569 Jeeps, 88,410 tanks. You're welcome. 5,777 merchant ships, 1,556 naval vessels, 6.5 million rifles, and something in the neighborhood of 40 billion bullets. By 1944, the United States was supplying 60% of the Allied munitions. And FDR went on these vast inspection tours all across the country to make sure that things were being done and being done right. Now, keep in mind, it was difficult for the president to get out of Washington, in part because of his physical condition, right? He had polio. It was difficult for him to travel, but also because the war demands were so important while he was in Washington. But here's a map that shows several of his trips around the country, and you can see it wasn't just like he was taking, little trips out of Washington to see what was going on around there. He went all around the country, through the middle of the country, through the north, down the west coast, through the south, even out to the Aleutian Islands and out to Pearl Harbor, all around the country, visiting the munition shops and machines and factories, because he wanted to make sure that we had what we were paying for, that we had what we need. And more importantly than that, or I should say maybe equally important to that, he wanted the folks that were in those factories, right? The men that hadn't gone to war, the women who became Rosie the Riveters, the folks that were in those factories, he wanted them to know that they were as important to the war effort as the young men and women who were in the active battle theaters. So it was a unified effort, all folks together. And when at home, the Roosevelts, which of course when they say home, they mean either Hyde Park or Washington, D.C., when they were home, the Roosevelts supported the troops and the war effort by doing things like purchasing war bonds, just like everyone else was encouraged to do. They installed blackout curtains on their windows, just like everyone else was supposed to do. They even shared in rationing. Here is Franklin Roosevelt's War Ration, Book 4, Franklin D. Roosevelt, White House, Washington, D.C. So they weren't just walking the walk or talking the talk, they were also walking the walk. And they were right there with the American people in terms of sacrificing on supplies and goods, just like everybody else was as well. In fact, all four of the Roosevelt boys were in the service. All right, they all joined in. Elliot was in the Army Air Corps. He's over here. And Franklin Jr. and John both entered the Navy. So we got those guys there. And James chose combat duty with the Marines. He received the Navy Cross and the Silver Star. And Franklin Jr. became a full commander and received a Purple Heart and a Silver Star, right? So again, these guys literally, the Roosevelts literally had some flesh in the game, as they say. So they understood what these guys and gals were going through. They were certainly a wartime family. Now, on the eve of the D-Day invasion, Franklin Roosevelt gives an address to the country, and it becomes known as the D-Day Prayer. And the title of our talk today, Pride of Our Nation, comes from that prayer. And Roosevelt goes to the airwaves on the eve of the night of the attack on D-Day, the effort to reclaim the European continent from the Nazis. And he understands what our boys and girls are facing, and he leads the weary country in a heartfelt, hopeful prayer, and a prayer that also has apprehension and weariness, because we didn't know if it was going to work. Right? We didn't know. So he says, and I'd like to read this to you. My fellow Americans, last night when I spoke with you about the fall of Rome, I knew that at that moment that the troops of the United States and our allies were crossing the channel in another and greater operation. It has come to pass with success thus far. And so in this poignant moment, I ask you to join with me in prayer. And this is read over the radio. It had been printed in newspapers and magazines all across the country, so people were able to follow along as well. And President Roosevelt says, Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day we have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. This is what these guys were doing. Lead them straight and true, give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness in their faith. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard, for the enemy is strong. He may hurl back our forces. Success may not come with rushing speed, but we shall return again and again. And we know that by thy grace and by the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph. They will be sore tired by night and by day, without rest until the victory is won. The darkness will be rent by noise and flame. Men's soul will be shaken with the violences of war. For these men are lately drawn from the ways of peace. They fight not for the lust of conquest. They fight to end conquest. They fight to liberate. They fight to let justice arise and tolerance and goodwill among thy people. They yearn but for the end of battle and for their return to the haven of home. Clearly, Roosevelt gets it. He understands the importance of our veterans. Now, failure on the D-Day invasion may not have necessarily meant defeat in the war, but it is certainly not an overstatement to point out that the fate of the free world rested in the hands and on the backs of millions of young American veterans. FDR knew it, he felt it, and he never forgot it, and he nervously monitored the progress of the work from back here at home. Now, back in 1940, right before we actually got in the war, Roosevelt saw the sign as our military was gearing up for the possibility of war. In the buildup of this, FDR realized that it was going to take both hard work, but also recreation, right? All work and no play is not good for anyone. And so he challenged 6 private organizations: the YMCA, the YWCA, the National Catholic Community Service, the National Jewish Welfare Board, the Travelers Aid Association, and the Salvation Army to pool their forces and their resources to create an organization called the United Service Organization, more popularly known as the USO. So Roosevelt was not just concerned with these troops being out on the battlefield, he also wanted them to have comfort and care when they weren't in battle. And so, here we see a picture. FDR says, USO deserves the support of every individual. And here we see Bob Hope, and he was very famous for doing his USO shows. And here's a couple of starlets, and they are entertaining and keeping the young men happy and entertained in the off hours between fighting and the war. Here's a Norman Rockwell cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And, it shows this young guy, and, he's being catered to by these 2 young women in the USO. Perhaps a little bit sexist, but the idea here being that we were taking care of our guys both on the front and also at home. And not only that, we were going to do it wherever they went. Okay, wherever they went. So Roosevelt wasn't just using our troops to an end. He was using our troops to win the war, but also understanding the human side of what they were up against as well. And the USO supported the relaxation and the entertainment and provided a little taste of home for the military personnel to recharge in their downtime. Now, a month after the Pearl Harbor attack in January of 1942, right? So the attack takes place on December 7th. And a month later, we're getting ready to have spring, right? Now it's early, it's still midwinter, right? So it's way early to be planning for the spring. But if you got big things going on, you got to start planning early. And so what happens is in January 1942, the baseball commissioner, Kennesaw Landis, sends FDR a letter asking his opinion on whether or not the baseball season in 1942 should be called off or whether or not it should continue. The question was, is baseball too frivolous to be doing while the world is at war, right, in this massive two-front global war? Are we going to see troop casualties listed on one page, troop casualties from battles listed on one page, and then turn the page and see baseball scores on the next page? Is that right? And he wasn't sure. Landis wasn't sure what to do about that. So he sends President Roosevelt a letter, and here is a handwritten copy of it. I know you can't see that so well, but just to give you an idea, right? And of course, it's always hard to read cursive, especially today because kids aren't being taught cursive so much anymore. So they type it up, and this is not much better in terms of quality of copy, but it's typed up. And Landis says, "Dear Mr. President, the time is approaching when, in ordinary conditions, our teams would be heading for spring training camps. However, inasmuch as these are not ordinary times, I venture to ask what you have in mind as to whether professional baseball should continue to operate. Of course, my inquiry does not relate at all to individual members of this organization whose status in the emergency is fixed by law operating upon all citizens. Normally, we have, in addition to the 16 major teams, approximately 320 minor teams, members of leagues playing in the United States and Canada. Health and strength to you and whatever else it takes to do this job. With great respect, yours truly, Kennesaw Landis." Now, what's interesting about this, ladies and gentlemen, is, and I know you can't make this out, but it's dated January 14th, 1942. January 14th, 1942. He gets a response from none other than Franklin Roosevelt, and he gets that response on January 15th, 1942. So with everything FDR has on his mind, this is an important topic for him. And so he writes back the very next day, and he says, "My dear Judge, thank you for yours of January 14th. As you will, of course, realize, the final decision about the baseball season must rest with you and the baseball club owners. So what I'm going to say is solely a personal and not an official point of view." Now, of course, anytime you're getting a letter from the president, it's going to have some weight behind it, right? And he goes on to say, "I honestly feel that it would be best for the country to keep baseball going. There will be fewer people unemployed, and everybody will work longer hours and harder than ever before. And that means that they ought to have a chance for recreation and for taking their minds off their work even more than before. Baseball provides a recreation which does not last over 2 or 2.5 hours and which can be got for very little cost. And incidentally, I hope that night games can be extended because it gives an opportunity to the day shift to see an occasional game. As to the players themselves, I know you will agree with me that individual players who are of active military or naval age should go without question into the service, even if the actual quality of the teams is lowered by the greater use of older players. This will not dampen the popularity of the sport. Of course, if any individual has some particular aptitude in a trade or profession, he ought to serve the government. That, however, is a matter which I know you can handle with complete justice. Here is another way of looking at it. If 300 teams use 500 if 300 teams use 5,000 or 6,000 players, these players are a definite recreational asset to at least 20 million of their fellow citizens. And that, in my judgment, is thoroughly worthwhile. With the very best wish, very sincerely yours, Franklin Roosevelt. So Roosevelt is even thinking about baseball. He's even thinking about the need for Americans at home to go to the game after a long shift at the factory, but also for the boys out in the field to follow along with their home teams as well, right? To see teams that are struggling, to see teams that are fighting, to see teams that are winning. This was important for the folks there on the battlefield as well. And he felt this was very important to the moral support of the workers as well. Now, feeling an enormous debt to American veterans, and fearing a disgraceful return when they come back after the end of the First World War, Roosevelt begins to come up with a plan. But before we do that, I want to show you some pictures of, here is President Roosevelt reviewing some troops. So here he is in the Jeep, and he's driving by, and of course they're saluting because he's the commander-in-chief, and he's got his hat off and over his heart, right, in a sign of respect and in a sign of honor, reviewing the troops as they go by. And so President Roosevelt is the guy here, and of course the military folks are back there. So keep in mind that the President of the United States is a civilian who is in charge of the military, but Roosevelt, of course, taking it very, very seriously. So he feels we have this big debt to these folks, right? Both in what they are doing now and when they return home. And after the veterans returned home from the First World War, there was a terrible thing that occurred. The returning veterans of the First World War came back to an economy that was not ready to absorb huge numbers of men coming in looking for work. As early as 1942, Franklin Roosevelt is already beginning to make plans on how to treat the returning vets once the war is over, right? So this guy is always thinking ahead. At the end of the First World War, nearly 1 million war-weary veterans returned home, and all they got for their service after returning home was a $60 payout and a train ticket to their home, right? A train ticket to the closest city to their home. And they came back to a market that was already flooded, a tight job market. They came back, tens of thousands of them, each couple of months coming in, looking for work, looking for jobs. And many of them were given free land to go out and become farmers. Hey, we got no jobs for you. Here's some free government land. Take over and, become a farmer. And this is what sows the seeds, no pun intended, of the Dust Bowl. Right, because they begin to overfarm the land, they begin to overproduce the land, they begin to wear out the soil. And so one of the policies of the government to handle the returning troops of the First World War ended up setting the stage for the Dust Bowl, which occurs later on. Now, these men come back and they demand and were promised a bonus for their service, right, in the war, right? Okay, so yeah, you guys, you did a fantastic job. You're in the war to end all wars. You're right. $60 and a bus ticket may not be enough. We're going to give you a bonus, okay? We're good for it. We're going to give you a bonus. But the bonus wasn't due to be paid out for another 20 years, all right? I don't care how tight you pinch a penny, okay? You got to eat or you're going to die well before 20 years is over. And so they were given this bonus, but they weren't allowed to collect it for 20 years or so. And so 20,000 of them marched upon Washington, D.C. and demanded that they be paid their bonus immediately. This was the famous bonus march. And President Hoover, right, not exactly known for his warm and fuzzy approach to things, ordered the army to go in and remove these guys, right? Hey, get them out of there, get them out, move them. And so none other than General Douglas MacArthur storms in, drives them out, and then sets their little tents and their little, squatters communities on fire. And this creates not only a blemish on our treatment of our veterans, certainly, but also a huge public relations problem for Hoover. And it just underscores this idea that he just doesn't care about people. He just doesn't care what happens. Now, that's not necessarily true, right? He certainly cared for people, but he just got this reputation because the actions he took were not considered to be warm and fuzzy in the classic sense. And so this helps Franklin Roosevelt be elected in 1932. And Roosevelt felt that the way that these troops were handled when they came back could have been handled much better. And he was looking forward to coming up with a solution that would prevent that from happening again. Now, keep in mind, we've just been through, 8-9 years of a Great Depression. Now the war economy has got us booming again, right? Because we were producing, all that material for the Allies and for ourselves. We've got full employment because most of the men are off at the war. We've got Rosie the Riveters back in the factories and such. But this is somewhat artificial. And we don't know if, once the war is over, if we're going to slingshot back into a Great Depression. And Roosevelt is very concerned about this. So on July 28th in 1943, Roosevelt lays out a broad framework for a plan in a fireside chat. And what he says in this fireside, plans for the return to civilized life of our gallant men and women in the armed services. They must not be demobilized into an environment of inflation and unemployment, to a place upon a bread line or on a corner selling apples. We must this time have plans ready. Instead of waiting to do so in a hasty and inefficient and ill-considered job at the last moment. So what he's saying here is, ain't going to happen again, right? We're going to have a plan for this. And his plan includes mustering out pay. And this, by the way, is called the GI Bill. This becomes the GI Bill. Mustering out pay that's large enough to cover a reasonable amount of time between the discharge and the finding of a new job. So it's not just a $60 payout, but all right, we're going to give you some mustering out pay that's going to keep you going here for the time being. There's going to be unemployment insurance, so that if you can't find a job after a diligent search and your payout runs out, we'll keep you on, some support here until you're able to find that job. We're not going to let you go to the poorhouse. He offers educational opportunities and training. And this is big for two reasons. Number one is most of these folks are not able to go to college, right? They don't have the money to go to college. College in this time is primarily for the rich. And so this gives these returning vets the opportunity to finish their education, to get an education, and to get some training or some retooling. So this has a double effect of, number one, educating and training these guys, but also keeping them in class and out of the job market for a period of time so that they're more easily able to be absorbed into the economy. He also proposes allowance for credit so that these guys can buy houses, so that these guys can buy cars, and the time in the service will count toward that credit so that, they could, somebody says, well, what have you done for the last 6 months? Yeah, I haven't seen you have a job in the last, 2 years. What have you been doing in the last, couple of years here? The fact that you were in the military will count as, okay, you were gainfully employed, let's say, for the purposes of this loan. Provisions for hospitalization and rehabilitation and medical care for disabled veterans. That's something very near and dear to Franklin Roosevelt's heart because he himself was disabled. And then also pensions for disabled veterans. So if they weren't able to return to some kind of gainful employment, they could collect a disability pension. Now, FDR worked with a sometimes reluctant Congress to create what was called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, aka the GI Bill. And on June 22nd, 1944, he signed the law, the bill into law, and the GI Bill gave the returning veterans a soft landing and the head start that they needed to get back in their lives in civilian life. By the time it expired in 1956, nearly 15 million vets had attended college or received training, and millions more had purchased homes and with low interest rates and such. The stability and the educational opportunities that came about through the GI Bill helped to pave the way for the American 1950s and the 1960s. Now, sadly, right, Jim Crow laws and Jim Crow attitudes prevented many veterans of color from fully participating in the GI Bill, but it helped to build the middle class in the country and ushered in an unprecedented. Now, isn't it nice to hear the word unprecedented about something good for a change? There was an unprecedented time of prosperity and improvement in the quality of life in American history, the biggest jump in that. So clearly, Franklin Roosevelt was a friend of America's veterans in both times of war and in times of peace. He wanted to make sure that that generation had what it needed to do the job it was being called to do. And he set a fine example himself of walking the walk and talking the talk and making sure that he was following the same rules he was asking other folks to live by. And he set a fine example of the pride, the respect, and the gratitude that we owe to our veterans. And so in the spirit of President Roosevelt, let's this week honor those veterans the way he did and the way that he would. If you know a veteran, thank them for their service. If you are a veteran, thank you for your service. We'll open it up to Q&A if we have any. Let's see what we got over here. Anything in the Q&A? Okay. All right, looks like we're not getting any questions or answers. You know what that means? That means that people, if there's anybody still watching, those of you that are not watching have probably gotten up, run out, and are honoring a veteran right now, which is exactly what you should be doing. Take the next couple of days, thank those veterans, because you know something? It's a cliche, but it's so true. Freedom ain't free, right? We live the life that we live, and we have the peace and the happiness and the security that we have because others have sacrificed in our honor, okay, and in our place. And, you know, ladies and gentlemen, in the world being what it is today, we need to thank these folks now more than ever. So have a very happy Veterans Day, Armistice Day, Remembrance Day, whatever it is that you want to call it. Just make sure you thank a vet. And if I don't see you between now and Thanksgiving, use that as a thankful time for you and your families as well. And we'll see you